He divorced her to protect her because distance meant protection. Now she is starving on the streets and pregnant with his child. Mafia boss Dante Morty thought everything had been handled with settlements. But when a call reveals she is unconscious in an unsafe neighborhood, a dark truth drops. His own men were ordered to cut her off. They wanted his pregnant ex-wife exposed as a threat before the child even existed. And Dante is about to make them a horrific example.
Let us look closely at Dante Morty, shall we? You and I have seen men like him, but none so tragically drawn. Picture his boardroom, a physical reflection of a guarded soul. Sound-swallowing walls designed to isolate. The lighting is cold, casting harsh shadows across Dante's unreadable face. Outside, the city screams, but in here, it is a sterile vacuum ruled by his ego. He sits at the head of the table, weaponizing silence. He does not shout. He lets ambient dread crush the room. A captain stammers through reports, while Dante slowly traces his whiskey glass with deadened eyes. There is a terrifying emptiness there. It is a quiet truth that building impenetrable walls to keep out the world only traps us inside with our own ghosts. Look closely at the hollow core of this man. 3 months ago, Dante ended his marriage to Alina with the same dead-eyed indifference he uses for cargo logistics. One signature, severing her from his life like a surgical cut. He convinced himself it was just a business move, masking his profound terror of real human connection, but fate always demands its due. As the sweating captain drones on, the absolute silence of Dante's fortress is breached. A harsh vibration from his phone cuts the heavy air. Around the dark table, every man freezes in place. Notice the bitter irony here. A person can spend their whole life building an illusion of absolute control, only for a single mechanical sound to rip the foundation right from under them. Only Marco is allowed to pierce the room's blackout. Notice Dante's slow body language here. He does not reach for the phone. He lets it vibrate, keeping a predatory stare locked firmly on the captain. He forces the man to crumble under the crushing weight of the interruption. Once the subordinate stammers to a halt, Dante picks up the phone with the terrifying precision of someone who believes he owns time itself. He speaks one flat word, yes, but on the other end, Marco hesitates. It is an agonizing pause. We often learn the hard way that the exact moment before our lives shatter is rarely marked by an explosion. Most of the time, the greatest tragedies begin with nothing more than a breathless, unexpected hesitation. You and I know that even the hardest masks hide fragile fractures. Marco's silence is the hammer striking the exact weak point. When he speaks, his voice is rough, causing an involuntary spasm in Dante's knuckles. We found her. 3 words bypass every iron wall Dante built, ripping open the repression buried beneath the divorce papers. Watch his eyes. The light drains out, detaching completely from the dark room. Your ex-wife. She is pregnant. 4 months. At those words, Dante's physical body freezes. His untouchable empire evaporates. He actually stops breathing. 4 months. The math crashes over him like a heavy wave. It is a harsh awakening, proving that no amount of ruthless power can ever protect a man from the irreversible consequences of his own past choices. That timeline violently strips away his delusion of control. It drags him back to that one night of raw vulnerability, the night he punished himself for, treating love like a fatal disease. He fled before sunrise, using divorce papers as a tourniquet to stop his own bleeding heart. Then Marco delivers the final blow. She is unconscious. Here is a simple truth we all must face. You can never outrun your own humanity, no matter how deeply you bury it. Watch the frame. See the exact moment Dante's internal architecture shatters. To the terrified men at the table, he merely stands up, but that sharp, violent scrape of his chair against the floorboards is the deafening sound of a hollow king entirely losing his grip on the universe he sacrificed his soul to build. The paralysis inside the boardroom is absolute. Dante whispers a demand for the location, the address immediately mapping to a dangerous, violent slum in his mind. The dark reality short-circuits his brain. He had wired her millions, foolishly believing that cash could cleanly wash away the tragedy of their ruined love. His massive ego never calculated the agonizing withdrawal Elena would endure. Like a wounded bird thrown from a golden cage, she spiraled into the gutters, subconsciously seeking the chaotic familiarity of fear. Why is she alone? Why is she hurt? His godlike self-image violently fractures under the weight of these terrifying questions. Boss, Marco pleads over the line, his usually dead voice suddenly spiking with a rare, undeniable panic. We need to move right now. Dante kills the call. Watch him closely here as you and I analyze this heartbreaking shift together. He reaches for his tailored coat with mechanical grace, but look at his hands. They are trembling. His jaw is locked so tight it might shatter. The godlike mask is dissolving into dust. Meeting is over. He growls. There is no strategy, no calm delegation. In an instant, the cold, untouchable kingpin devolves into a desperate, terrified father. When a foolish captain dares to ask about the docks, Dante's quiet command to handle it is not a business order. It is a lethal promise of violence. He storms out of the room, radiating a dark, frantic heat. True love, when buried alive for too long, will always violently tear its way back to the surface. Follow the camera as it tracks Dante down the long, shadowed corridor. Armed guards stiffen as he passes, sensing the storm. He demands absolute control, but step inside the descending elevator with him. Watch his posture finally break. He leans against the mirrored wall, haunted by the ghost of Elena from 4 months ago. She stood at the door with one small suitcase, turning back, praying he would beg her to stay. He merely watched her leave. He disguised his emotional cowardice as logic, telling himself love was a weakness. The tragedy of the human heart is that we constantly tell ourselves noble lies to avoid facing our deepest fears. Stepping out into the freezing city air, the massive empire he built suddenly means absolutely nothing to a man entirely losing his mind. The external world still bows to his wealth. Marco has the black sedan idling at the curb. Dante slides into the leather seats, the heavy armored door sealing shut with the finality of a vault. The engine roars, tires screaming against the asphalt, yet Dante feels none of it. His dark eyes stare blankly through the tinted glass, completely blind to the passing streetlights. All he sees is Elena, lying cold and broken on dirty concrete, holding the fragile life of his unborn child. For a man who plays God, there is no hell worse than total powerlessness. Paralyzing, agonizing fear finally sinks its claws into his chest, entirely unforgiving. But the cruelest twist of this tragedy is that miles away, Elena had already been living in that exact same terrifying nightmare for months. Let us shift the lens to Elena, capturing the brutal reality of her collapse. Her bare knees slam against the frozen concrete, a sharp jolt of pain rocketing up her spine. Notice the sheer apathy of the city. Blinding headlights cut through the fog, and faceless pedestrians step over her as if she were a fallen shadow. This profound isolation is the heaviest burden of all. Yet, even as her vision fades to black, a fierce maternal instinct overrides her failing body. She curls inward, pressing a trembling, dirt-stained hand over her stomach. She is desperate to shield the only pure thing left in her ruined world. She never wanted to fall this far. It reminds us of a bitter truth. Life rarely ever asks for our permission before it completely, devastatingly falls to pieces. Lying on the pavement, fragments of her past flash like broken glass. She remembers the sprawling penthouse, the icy perfection of marble floors, the suffocating quiet of infinite wealth, the rich spice of Dante's cologne. She had allowed herself to believe that Golden Cage was a forever home. Her trust was a beautiful, fatal mistake. When the end came, it was not a tearful goodbye. It was an execution. The divorce severed her life like a guillotine, silent, swift, and absolute. Lawyers handed her papers without a single word of explanation. She was erased from his kingdom before sunset. There is a deeply painful lesson woven into her scars. Placing your entire sense of security into the hands of another human being is the most dangerous gamble a person can ever make. You and I have witnessed this tragic downfall too many times. Picture her standing in the rain, clutching that thick manila envelope, her entire identity erased with the stroke of a pen. She dialed his private number until her fingers bled, begging for a lifeline. Every single call was met with a cold, manufactured silence, blocked by men paid to forget her name. She thought he was just angry. She thought the monster would eventually soften. By the time the suffocating reality of her exile took root, it was entirely too late. The meager payout vanished instantly. Rent and medical bills devoured her savings, leaving her starving in the bitter cold. It is terrifying how quickly a life of velvet and silk can dissolve into a bloody, desperate fight just to survive the night. Let's look closely at how the human spirit fights to survive. Elena started selling off the heavy gilded chains of her past, the expensive jewelry first, then the designer dresses. Every pawn shop visit was a painful stripping away of the false identity he had forced upon her. But the real tragedy wasn't losing the money, it was the absolute shattering of her safety. That illusion broke the moment she realized she was completely alone on these cold streets, carrying a child she fiercely refused to regret. The body always keeps the score, doesn't it? Her dizzy spells had started weeks ago, dismissed as mere exhaustion. It is a harsh but simple truth of life. Our minds can easily ignore the loudest physical alarms when we are desperately focused on just making it to tomorrow. The camera pulls back to reveal the grim reality of her daily life. Working bone-crushing shifts at a local diner, her body finally betrayed her. The manager saw only a liability, a weak link, and mercilessly slashed her hours. Her meager income evaporated overnight. Suddenly, a simple meal became a rare luxury, strictly rationed. She starved herself, ignoring her own human needs, just to keep the fragile life inside her growing. It is a heartbreaking twist on the safety Dante once promised. When powerful men treat human beings like disposable chess pieces, it is always the innocent who suffer. It serves as a quiet, devastating reminder. True strength isn't measured by how ruthlessly you can control people, but by how deeply and selflessly you care for them. You and I know what happens when the human body runs entirely on empty. The brain simply starts to shut down. Let the lens focus on Elena, pushed to the absolute edge of collapse. She had eaten nothing but a discarded half sandwich in over 24 hours. The dark street began to spin around her. The glowing yellow street lamps smeared into long, distorted streaks of light. Watch her hand tremble as she reaches for the cold metal of a park bench, her fingers slipping helplessly as her strength vanishes. She hits the concrete hard, but the impact feels miles away, a merciful detachment from the brutal physical pain. The deafening roar of city traffic bleeds out into a quiet, distant hum, leaving her alone with nothing but the shallow, broken rhythm of her own breathing. Every single breath became a desperate fight for air. And right here, at the absolute breaking point, her mind did something tragic. It retreated to the very man who broke her. She didn't see the cold, calculating monster who had abandoned her. Instead, she clung to the warm, perfect ghost of the man from their first dates. It is a devastating reality of trauma. Sometimes we hold on to the twisted shadow of our captor just to feel safe. His name slipped through her chapped lips. Dante. It was barely a whisper, heavy with an ocean of unspoken grief. Her cold fingers instinctively curled tightly over her stomach. "I am trying," she whispered into the freezing night. It is a haunting question whether she was begging the man who ruined her or the tiny life fighting to survive inside her. "I am really trying," she breathed, her voice breaking as her body finally surrendered to the crushing exhaustion she had fought off for weeks. The winter chill pierced through her thin coat, swallowing her still form as the world went entirely black. But right before the darkness took her, a tiny, fragile flutter against her palm pulled her back. A heartbeat. She was not alone. Now, watch the shadows shift as the predator enters the frame. A heavy black sedan turned onto the dead street, moving with a fast, calculated aggression. Its bright headlights sliced right through the gloom, exposing the cracked pavement and boarded-up windows. The car didn't slow down. It tore through the forgotten neighborhood, radiating a heavy, terrifying aura of complete and utter dominance. Inside the suffocating silence of the car, Dante sat completely motionless. He didn't need to speak to rule the space. The sheer, oppressive weight of his presence wrapped around his men like a tightened noose. Marco, sitting in the front seat, gripped the wheel with a rigid jaw, his eyes frantically scanning the darkness. Up ahead, Marco finally muttered, pointing to the left side near a broken bus stop. He kept his voice flat and careful, terrified that a single loud word might ignite his boss's explosive temper. The heavy car glided to a smooth stop, but Dante was already moving. He threw the heavy door open with a violent, reckless force that shattered the dead quiet of the street, the sound ringing out like a sudden gunshot in the dead of night. The biting wind hit him instantly, but he didn't feel the cold. His dark eyes locked onto the small, broken figure on the pavement, his vision tunneling until nothing else existed. You and I need to pause and look at the sheer denial playing out in his mind right here. For a split second, his arrogant, controlling brain flat out rejected what he was seeing. He tried to tell himself she was fine, perfectly safe under the massive surveillance web he controlled. But that fragile lie crumbled the second his expensive leather shoes hit the pavement beside her. "Elena," he whispered. The word fell out of him, cracked and hollow, entirely stripping away the terrifying mask of the untouchable crime boss. She lay there on the frozen concrete, completely blind and deaf to his arrival. She was curled tightly on her side, her trembling hand locked fiercely over her stomach. Even as her body shut down, the fierce, beautiful instinct of a mother fighting to protect her child kept her grounded. Dante slammed onto his knees, dragging his pristine, expensive coat through the filthy street. For a man obsessed with perfect control and image, this sudden, careless desperation reveals everything. The only things that mattered were the terrifying shallowness of her breath and the ghostly white color of her face under the flickering street lamp. "Cristo," he breathed out. It was a raw, unfiltered sound of pure terror. His shaking fingers reached out, hesitating just a second before brushing against her hollow cheek. The skin beneath his hand was like solid ice. This wasn't just the cold weather taking hold. This was the brutal physical cost of his neglect, the tragic decay of someone deprived of basic human survival. Acting purely on instinct, Dante's shaking hands gently brushed the dirty hair from her face, exposing the sharp, hollowed-out bones of her cheeks. This starved, broken reality violently destroyed the perfect, untouched memory of her he had kept in his head. "Boss," Marco called out softly from the shadows, stepping out of the car. "We have to go. She has been out here way too long." Dante didn't even hear him. His dark, intense gaze had dropped lower, finally locking onto the soft, undeniable curve hidden beneath her oversized, worn-out sweater. It was a terrifying, beautiful detail he had completely missed. In that single heartbeat, his entire universe shifted on its axis. 4 months, it was no longer just an abstract number in his head. It was a living, breathing reality pressing right against his palm. She was carrying his child out here in the freezing dark, entirely outside of his suffocating control. For a man who needs to play God with everyone's life, there is no greater terror than realizing he is powerless. The muscles in his jaw locked tight as a dark, violent rage began to boil up inside him. "How long?" he demanded. The deep, lethal drop in his voice forced the men behind him to freeze, bracing for a sudden bloodbath. How long has she been lying here like this? Marco swallowed hard, his voice trembling for just a second. "We do not know for sure, boss. We got the call from one of the street watchers 10 minutes ago," Marco stammered out. He said she just collapsed out of nowhere. There was a slight hesitation before he made the call. At that word, Dante went totally rigid. He slowly stood up, turning his head onto Marco with the cold, dead eyes of a predator about to strike. Hesitation. In Dante's world, a delayed phone call was an unforgivable sin, a mistake paid for with blood. Marco took a slow, shaky breath. "You told them to just watch her. The orders were strict. Do not step in unless someone attacks her." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the frozen street. Dante slowly turned his eyes back down to Elena. He had locked her out of his life to keep her safe, and his arrogance had nearly killed her. Seeing her lying broken on the pavement finally shattered his ego. His distance hadn't acted as a shield. His absence had built the very trap that was starving her to death. He squeezed her freezing fingers, desperately trying to anchor himself to the ground as his illusion of being a perfect protector fell to pieces. "Get the car running right now," he ordered, his voice cold and leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We are not taking her to a public hospital." Marco gave a quick, tense nod. "Already done. A private clinic, 0 paper trail, and no questions asked." "Good." Dante slid his heavy arms gently under her back and knees, lifting her off the ice. She weighed almost nothing. It was a terrifying realization of just how much of her had faded away in the dark. The camera lingers on Dante in the oppressive lighting of the garage. The sheer weight of Elena's fading heartbeat anchors in his chest like suffocating iron. He holds her limp, fragile frame against his collarbone, the lens catching a slight tremble in his usually rigid hands. The faint, ghostly brush of her breath against his neck is the only proof she hasn't slipped away entirely. "Stay with me," he whispers, the sound tearing through the quiet air. "You do not get to disappear like this." He carries her to the car with terrifying, mechanical precision, yet beneath that cold mask, his psyche is violently fracturing. The walls we build to protect our feelings are often the very things that end up crushing them. The heavy vehicle door slams shut, sealing them in. Dante pulls her into the shadows of the back seat, desperately cradling her against the chill. Inside the speeding car, heavy silence amplifies the frantic beating of his heart. His trembling hand instinctively moves to rest over her abdomen, drawn to the unborn life he completely failed to protect. "Drive," he orders. The tires scream against the asphalt as the car surges forward. Streetlights wash rhythmically over his tense face, revealing a downward, obsessive gaze fixed on Elena's hollowed cheeks. He is cataloging every ounce of life drained from her. His thumb presses against her frail wrist, finding a weak, erratic pulse. For a normal soul, this tiny flicker of life would bring absolute relief. But we must remember, twisting love into ownership only breeds terrible destruction. Inside Dante, a dark, consuming pathology is taking deep root, far removed from any gentle compassion. The shadow of vengeance clouds his eyes. What stirs within him now is infinitely darker than the organic fear of loss. The camera pans to the cold calculation hardening his features. Every ticking second forms a crushing reality. Someone else permitted this decay, allowing his ultimate obsession to wither right to the edge of death without his knowledge. Here is a profound truth you and I must carry. True love demands that we let go of control. Treating another human as a prized possession ultimately shatters the very soul you claim to cherish. Dante is entirely blind to this. He shifts his chilling gaze to the dark window glass, his reflection forming a mask of pure tragedy and malice. "Marco," he says softly, his voice utterly devoid of any natural warmth, "find out exactly who was responsible for watching her tonight. Today, let us examine the tragic portrait of a broken man backed into a corner. Watch closely as the lens captures Dante's reaction to this unbearable truth. His hand tightens its grip on Elena, not out of tender affection, but absolute possession. In this cinematic frame, she is merely his object. "Do not bring me excuses," he commands his driver, the pitch dropping into the terrifying, deadened register of a predator. The vehicle tears through the night toward a hidden underground clinic, visually mirroring his deep psychological need to control life outside the bounds of society. Sometimes, an obsession with power leaves you utterly powerless. For Dante, this oversight is not a mistake, it is a profound betrayal. And to a man whose entire existence relies on dominance, betrayal is nothing less than a declaration of total war. The scene cuts to the clinic interior, a sterile, silent space, perfectly reflecting the architecture of a troubled mind. Cold lighting bounces off spotless surfaces, designed for absolute control and hiding from the light of day. The heavy gates slide open, feeding Dante's tragic delusion that he dictates fate itself. Stepping into the stark hallway, he never looks at the building. The camera stays tight on his chest, where he clutches Elena as if holding his own beating heart. Medical staff scramble into the frame. Dante barks for her vitals, his voice echoing like gunfire. The lead doctor warns she is unstable, pleading for the gurney, but Dante refuses to let go. True security comes from trust, not force. Yet he holds on to the victim, desperately trying to dictate the terms of her fragile survival through his sheer willpower. Notice the agonizing pause in the frame. Dante locks his darkened eyes with the lead physician, silently weighing if this man is worthy of touching his whole world. The doctor speaks of severe dehydration and starvation, his tone extremely cautious to prevent a violent eruption. Slowly, Dante lowers her onto the crisp white sheets. The camera captures the tragic mechanics of his movement. His trembling hands linger on her pale skin just a heartbeat too long. Releasing someone we love, even to save them, is the hardest surrender of all. For Dante, giving up control sparks an unbearable psychological torment. He immediately shadows the gurney down the fluorescent corridor. His sheer, terrifying presence causes the nurses to instinctively shrink back, parting. like still water before an approaching storm. The rhythmic hum of medical machinery fills the audio track, a fragile melody of life hanging by a thread. Wires snake across her skin, tracking the deep physiological damage that fear had kept hidden. Dante stands rigid at the foot of the bed, bathed in the blue glow of the monitors. He watches the plummeting numbers not with gentle tears, but as a devastating audit of what was stolen from him. Her pulse is faint. Then, the doctor drops a quiet revelation. She is 4 months pregnant. Dante's posture hardens instantly. For a man so damaged, a child is not merely a blessing. It is the ultimate extension of his own broken legacy. The desire to leave a mark on this earth can consume us if we forget to nurture the life already here. In this icy room, he leaves no space for grief, only absolute chilling resolve. Behind his hollow eyes, Dante pieces together the tragic timeline. The unreturned calls, the heavy silence, her desperate bids to escape him. The doctor's voice trembles as he orders immediate scans, warning of the catastrophic risk to her shattered body. The camera pushes in slowly on Dante. He closes the space between them, his gaze fixed on Alina's fragile face with terrifying intensity. "You save both," he whispers into the silence. It sounds like a plea, but the underlying tone is a lethal, unbending threat. He strips away their medical judgment, replacing it with a singular, dark commandment. Trying to force every outcome only blinds us to the damage we cause. The room descends into a highly choreographed panic. Nurses adjust intravenous lines, hyper-aware of the dangerous shadow looming just steps away. Watch how the director frames his body language. Dante refuses the chair in the corner. He stands entirely motionless, a statue carved out of grief and rage. His mind filters this tragedy strictly through the lens of power rather than simple human empathy. True healing requires vulnerability, but he views any crack in his armor as fatal. Marco steps into the tense lighting, his movements heavy and measured, whispering that the perimeter is fully secured. Dante lets a suffocating silence drag out, a classic demonstration of control. Before finally shifting his cold eyes, he demands to know about the guard. Marco hesitates, a brief, fatal flinch of fear, stammering that the man is in custody. Dante replies softly that he will handle the interrogation himself. A slight clench of his jaw betrays the violent inferno inside. That microscopic shift in his jaw signals an impending tragedy. He quietly tells Marco that he should already know if the guard is lying to save his life. Marco looks down, terrified, mentioning a slight inconsistency in the story. In Dante's fiercely guarded universe, even the smallest lie is an act of total betrayal. We often forget that demanding absolute perfection from others leaves us incredibly isolated in the end. He turns his tragic gaze back to Alina, watching the jagged lines of the monitor. Marco nervously explains, the guard claims he followed the rules, watching her waste away because there was no outside attack. Dante's eyes darken with murderous clarity. The guard did not view her slow starvation as a crisis. In the dreadful quiet, Dante reaches out to gently touch Alina's fragile, icy wrist. Beneath his fingertips, the fluttering pulse is dangerously thin. Dante murmurs to the shadows that those were never his instructions. The pitch of his voice plummets, shedding all reactive panic for a chilling, predatory calm. Listen carefully to his dialogue. I do not leave what belongs to me unprotected. It is the ultimate tragic objectification. To him, she is a stolen masterpiece, not a breathing woman. Clinging too tightly to love turns it into a prison for both people. Marco remains dead silent, completely broken to this terrifying worldview. The head physician steps back into the frame, wiping sweat from his brow, quietly announcing, They have stabilized her failing organs for now. He stops short, too frightened to speak of the haunting risks that remain. Dante's blank expression fractures just enough to ask about his unborn child. The doctor stammers out confirmation of a tiny heartbeat, carefully adding that both mother and child are resting on a knife's edge of fragility. But a mind like Dante's entirely rejects the concept of weakness. He moves closer to the bed, his trembling hand hovering over her pale cheek, but never making contact. "Fix it," he commands softly, the words landing like a judge's final sentence. The doctor offers a desperate promise to do his very best. Dante's deep psychological damage flares violently. He locks onto the doctor's eyes, erasing all humanity from the room. "That is not what I said," he hisses. True strength is accepting what we cannot change, but Dante demands the universe bow to his grief. The terrified doctor nods weakly as Dante stares down at the devastating physical toll he somehow failed to prevent. "Let us pause right here, you and I, to witness how a broken mind digests absolute failure." The camera tracks his hollow gaze as he reviews his rigid, obsessive security measures. He quickly concludes this tragedy was no simple mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated strike. As the silence deepens, his profound paranoia hardens into cold stone. Someone intentionally allowed his precious world to burn. Look at the framing of his hands. His knuckles turn white as they slowly curl around the steel bedrail. A lesser man would shatter the glass and scream until his lungs gave out. But burying our pain only breeds monsters. Dante bypasses the loud, chaotic grief entirely. The scene fades out on his rigid silhouette, a man slipping quietly into the darkest, most terrifying depths of a hyper-focused, murderous revenge. The camera pushes in on Dante. What replaces his fury is a cold, calculated permanence. His eyes remain locked on Alina's fragile form as he quietly orders Marco to uncover the rat who altered his directive. His voice drops to a chilling whisper. "Do not bring the traitor to him yet." Marco assumes this delay is mere protocol, but watch Dante closely. He lets his hand lower, his knuckles brushing against Alina's pale fingers, needing a physical anchor to ground his fractured ego. He must map every vein of this betrayal before he cuts it out. The detached rhythm of the heart monitor keeps time, measuring this psychological war. It is a harsh truth. The deepest betrayals force us to realize what we truly value, right before we burn the world down to keep it. Dante remains frozen beside the bed, a statue sculpted by his own obsession, refusing to let her slip away a second time. A silent war rages behind his dark eyes. Now, the camera shifts, and you and I are pulled into Alina's waking mind. In survivors of profound trauma, consciousness does not return softly. It shatters into sharp fragments. The mechanical beeping registers first, crashing into her senses. Then comes the physical reality. The freezing pavement is replaced by the suffocating softness of hospital linens. The air reeks of antiseptic, yet it carries a much darker, familiar scent her mind struggles to place. We often block out the things that hurt us most, a tragic defense mechanism that shields the heart when the mind is simply too broken to understand the pain. Alina tries to move, but her limbs are leaden. Her motor functions unresponsive, the physical manifestation of a soul pushed past its breaking point. A raw groan tears from her throat. The heart monitor spikes, screaming her wakefulness. Into the room, heavy, deliberate footsteps cross the floor. Easy. That single word slices through her mental fog. It is him. Notice the absolute terror in her body language. Her breath catches violently before her eyelids even flutter open. She dissociates, begging the universe that this is just a cruel hallucination. It is the deep tragedy of a captive heart. Our minds will often project the very source of our darkest terror as a desperate form of false comfort, clinging to the familiar when we have absolutely nothing else left. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Alina's eyes finally open, but the crushing weight in the room does not vanish. The harsh light paints the glint of the space. And then she sees him, Dante. He stands, looming over the bed, his jaw pulled tight, his dark eyes shadowed by exhausting paranoia. He does not look at her with the gentle relief of a loving husband. He watches her with the chilling focus of a predator who has just reclaimed a stolen artifact. The silence stretches, thick and suffocating. "You should not be here," she whispers. Her voice is shattered, completely devoid of anger. True tragedy lies not in the furious fighting of a storm, but in the quiet, hollow disbelief of a person who finally realizes their deepest nightmare is never truly over. Dante's response remains unnervingly flat, masking a terrifying volatility beneath measured words. Instinctively, Alina's trembling hand drops to protect her stomach. The camera lingers on this gesture, a primal, maternal defense, anchoring her broken spirit to the innocent life inside her. Her throat visibly constricts. "How long?" she asks. 4 months, Dante replies. There is zero hesitation. Watch the coldness of his pathology. "You are certain?" she murmurs, a flicker of reality piercing her exhaustion. "I do not deal in uncertainty," he states flatly. This is the tragic flaw of his existence. He demands a perfectly calculated world, stripping away all unpredictability, yet completely forgetting that the true essence of human life is found within its messy, uncontrollable emotions. Even the end of their marriage was executed with clinical precision. No closure, just a unilateral severing. To him, she was merely a variable removed from his stage. Her lips part, yielding a fragile accusation laced with the tragic sorrow of a captive. She still aches for the monster who broke her. "Then you should have known," she breathes. The camera catches a microscopic flinch in Dante's shoulders, revealing the agony required to hold his mask in place. "I should have," he concedes. 3 words carrying an ocean of dark gravity. Alina exhales a shuddering breath as the room seems to tilt. "I tried to tell you," she whispers. "It is a vital lesson. Silencing someone does not erase their truth. It only guarantees that the ghost of their unspoken words will eventually return to haunt you." She catalogues her frantic attempts to reach him. "I called your office," she cries. "I went to the restaurant. I sent emails. I even waited outside your building." She stops, swallowing her degraded pride. "It does not matter." Dante's voice cracks like a whip. "It matters." Her eyes narrow, fighting the destructive pull he still holds over her. "Does it? Because your decision was absolute." Dante steps closer, weaponizing his frame until the oxygen in the room evaporates. "I gave orders," he growls, his tone dropping to a lethal hum. "Specific ones. You were supposed to be protected." A hollow laugh falls from her lips. It is a dangerous tragedy. When we place all our faith in absolute authority, we blind ourselves to the unpredictable chaos of human betrayal. "Protected?" she repeats, the word turning to ash on her tongue. "I have been surviving in a single room with broken heating. Our gobble shifts simply to exist. I have not eaten a proper meal in days." Her fingers dig protectively into her stomach. "Stick with me. This is where it gets interesting." We are watching the exact moment the godlike architecture of Dante's mind fractures. It is the terrifying realization that his absolute rule was defied. "That is not what I ordered," he mutters. Alina stares at him, a tragic detachment washing over her face. "Then perhaps your commands hold far less power than you believe," she whispers, The silence is deafening. True power, we ultimately learn, is never about the orders we shout, but the genuine loyalty of those meant to follow them. Dante turns his back, his hand dragging slowly down his jawline. We are witnessing a narcissist viciously recalculating his broken reality, realizing someone poisoned his design. When he turns back, every trace of vulnerability is gone, replaced by the cold clarity of a reaper. "Who stopped you?" he asks. His soft voice drips with impending slaughter. Elena squints through her haze, her throat tightening as the terrible memory takes shape. A man from security. "He had a scar on his cheek," she trembles. "He told me you would file a restraining order if I ever returned." The air in the room instantly drops below freezing. The hardest lesson of blind pride is discovering that the towering walls you built to keep enemies out are the exact same ones trapping the deadly poison inside. Dante stands rigid, the pitch-black storm in his eyes triggering a primal panic within Elena. "Did he?" She begs, her voice shaking as her trauma bond shatters. "Did you tell him that?" Dante's denial is a swift execution. "No," one word. Instantly, the foundation of her nightmare crumbles. Her exhausted mind scrambles to survive the cognitive dissonance. "Then why?" she weeps. "Because someone wanted you entirely severed," Dante replies, his voice dropping to a sub-zero vibration, isolated and invisible. Her trembling hand flinches toward her stomach. "Why?" Dante's eyes track the movement, a lethal predator surfacing from the abyss. It is a dark truth. The deepest wounds are rarely inflicted by our enemies, but by the unseen, treacherous hands hiding quietly within our own trusted walls. Because you are carrying something they cannot afford to let exist. The declaration hangs in the air, an inescapable death sentence. This is no longer a fractured romance. It is an unforgivable assault on a dangerous man's legacy. You and I are going to step into this aftermath together. The camera cuts to a decaying warehouse by the river, a rotting architectural corpse. Inside, the space is masterfully engineered for a white light slashes violently across the cold concrete, casting long shadows into corners where the silence feels unbearably heavy. The air is putrid, reeking of oil, rust, and the metallic tang of raw human panic. When blind vengeance becomes a man's only religion, the dark temples he builds are always constructed from pure, unending agony. Dante steps over the threshold. The shift is terrifying. Watch how a sociopath alters the molecular weight of a room just by entering. Every guard stiffens, reacting to the apex predator in their midst. In the center of this brutal theater sits Tommaso, strapped to a bolted metal chair. His chin slumps against his chest, dried blood painting his jawline. He is battered, breathing jaggedly, yet entirely conscious. This is not the work of a mindless thug. It is the surgical application of extreme torment. The trauma was measured perfectly, enough pain to shatter his defenses, but never enough to grant the mercy of blacking out. True monsters never just destroy your physical form. They carefully break your mind so you are forced to feel every agonizing second of the long drop to the bottom. The camera pushes in slowly on Marco. He stands in the harsh, flickering basement light, sleeves rolled past bruised knuckles. His face is a carved mask of professional detachment. He has been cooperative, Marco reports, though the syllables land like dead weight. He quickly amends to a point. Dante offers absolutely no response. He glides forward with the terrifying deliberation of a stalking predator, halting only when the space between him and his captive vanishes. For a suffocating eternity, Dante weaponizes the silence, letting the psychological pressure crush his victim's sanity. Tommaso physically unravels, his chest heaving, forced to look into the void of Dante's eyes. You and I know this profound truth. Sometimes silence is the heaviest weapon a man can wield. The lighting catches the exact moment Tommaso breaks. Their eyes lock, and the snap of his mental fortitude practically echoes in the damp room. "Boss," his voice splinters, leaking pure terror. "I can explain." Dante just tilts his head, looking like a grim scientist studying a fatally flawed specimen. "Explain what?" Dante whispers, his tone dangerously light. "How my former wife ended up starving in a district where I do not even permit my enemies to tread, or how my unborn heir was abandoned without the protection I mandated." Tommaso swallows down his panic, eyes darting frantically. "That was not how it was supposed to unfold," he stammers. "It is a tragic reality we must all face. Desperation always strips away our dignity when basic survival is on the line." "The instructions I received, they were altered," Tommaso pleads, his shadow trembling against the wall. Dante's gaze narrows just a fraction. It is a microscopic shift, yet it radiates lethal intent. "Altered how?" "I was commanded to sever all her ties." Tommaso begs, panic taking root. "Total isolation." "I was informed she needed to be erased, that it was your absolute will." A harsh vibration rumbles in Dante's chest, a laugh devoid of any warmth. "And you accepted that narrative?" Tommaso hesitates for a fatal second. "Yes," he admits. "You wanted her gone." Dante steps into his personal space, turning the air to a vice. We often blindly trust authority, forgetting that unquestioning obedience can easily become the ultimate betrayal. "You are not compensated for your cognitive deductions," Dante whispers, the sound slicing the air like a razor. "You are compensated for executing my directives with flawless precision." Tommaso gasps for oxygen. "I did." "No," Dante interjects smoothly. "You obeyed someone else." The suffocating quiet reclaims the room. Let us look at this together. Beneath his terror lies a desperate evasion. This exact deception turns Dante's demand completely glacial. "Who issued the command?" he demands. Tommaso shakes his head. "No one. I assumed." "You assumed incorrectly." Dante grips the man's jaw. The lesson is painfully clear here. Blindly trusting a broken system without verifying the source is simply a guarantee of your own sudden downfall. We must examine the dark pathology of control in this frame. Dante speaks softly, yet his voice carries the lethal weight of a megalomaniac. "You let her starve," he states, speaking of Alina and the unborn child he views as his possession. Tommaso strains against the restraints, weeping, claiming the orders came from above. But Dante does not accept mitigating factors. To him, failure is indistinguishable from treason. Tommaso's psychological defenses shatter completely. The tragic response of prey realizing the predator cannot be bargained with. Life teaches us a hard truth here. When we willingly surrender our moral compass to the whims of others, we alone pay the steepest price. Dante's grip tightens, asserting his terrifying dominance. "Higher than me?" Dante asks. Watch the lighting catch the genuine fascination in his eyes. For a man accustomed to godhood, the concept of a higher authority is a dark joke. Tommaso hesitates. In that excruciating second of silence, Dante extracts the truth. When the prisoner finally breaks, he confesses the funds were traced to the Russo family. That name hangs in the damp air like toxic vapor. Marco visibly tenses, his hand drifting toward his weapon in a loyal reaction. Yet Dante remains perfectly, terrifyingly motionless. The universe constantly reminds us of this reality. The most dangerous threats do not announce themselves with explosive, fiery rage. They go entirely still, quietly calculating their next fatal strike. To Dante, the shadow of the Russo organization is not merely a business dispute. It is an intimate, unforgivable violation. His mind, devoid of ordinary empathy, rapidly connects the data points. The altered directives, the financial starvation, the severed communications. It was a masterful psychological operation. They aimed to isolate Alina entirely, stripping away her safety nets until she developed an engineered vulnerability. We often forget a crucial lesson about conflict. True power is never demonstrated through loud, violent declarations. It is executed through quiet, systematic dismantling. Dante realizes they wanted to expose his only hidden weakness. They didn't just want her gone, he murmurs, his voice a chilling echo directed solely at his own calculating intellect. Marco offers a grim nod, processing the tactical reality. A solitary, unprotected woman is the ultimate easy target in their brutal world. Dante's focus brutally shifts to the unborn child, an extension of his own monumental ego, a legacy threatened before taking a breath. Tommaso, chained and trembling, begs for his life. He pleads that he never intended for this to escalate, believing it was just an operation to keep Alina away. Dante looks down at him, and the final traces of humanity are wiped clean from his expression. There is no rage left, only the cold detachment of an executioner. "You do not need to know," Dante whispers. "It is a sobering lesson we must all carry. Ignorance of the harm we participate in will never absolve us of its devastating consequences." Tommaso freezes. His last shreds of hope dissolve, leaving only the agonizing realization of impending death. The air turns to ice. Everyone understands the terminal diagnosis. Dante turns his back. His mind is already detached from the dying man, focusing instead on the catastrophic territorial violation. Someone dared to touch his property. When Marco asks for final instructions, Dante does not even pause his measured stride. "Make it known," he commands, his voice as indifferent as a surgeon making a cut, "that this is what happens when someone interferes with my family." The heavy iron door swings wide, letting in the biting wind. We would do well to remember this dark truth. True cruelty is rarely born of fiery passion. It is almost always born of cold, unyielding pride. "And Marco," Dante adds, leaving a calculated pause for the psychological weight to settle, "this is not over. What started as an oversight has mutated into a scorched earth war. Stick with me as the camera shifts to reflect his fracturing psyche. The hospital is no longer a sanctuary. It is a paranoid fortress locked down by men operating outside the law. Dante stands rigid behind the sterile glass of the intensive care unit. Inside, Alina lies tethered to relentless machines, a fragile soul trapped in clinical tubes. She appears incredibly diminished, stripped of her autonomy. It is a tragic, inescapable truth of the human condition. We often only recognize the vital presence of a loved one when they are brutally reduced to a fading ghost of themselves. I want you to carefully observe Dante in this frame. The quiet defiance Alina once radiated is entirely gone. She is painfully pale, hovering like a specter in the space between existence and nothingness. For the first time, we see a visible crack in Dante's rigid armor. An intrusive emotion is threatening his absolute control. A mind like his cannot process raw grief, so he forcefully converts it into a terrifying need for retaliation. The relentless beep of the heart monitor is his only anchor. She is fighting, and deep within her, another fragile life is fighting the dark too. The lesson written in this tragedy is profound. Even in the absolute darkest, most ruthlessly controlled environments, the sheer human will to survive is a miracle that defies all logical calculation. A micro-expression of tension flickers across Dante's jaw. His analytical mind is torturing him, reviewing his decisions frame by frame. He executed the divorce with surgical precision, convinced that severing Alina from his life would shield her from his underworld. It is a tragic delusion among powerful people, the belief that their absence equates to safety. Instead, his abandonment created the exact void his enemies exploited. Marco approaches, footsteps masked by the sterile hum of the ward. Security is doubled, Marco reports, his voice tight with unfamiliar anxiety. Inner perimeters, outer zones, even nurses are locked under suffocating surveillance. This teaches us a painful reality. Control, once foolishly discarded, is always desperately and obsessively reclaimed. No one enters without being cleared 3 separate times, Marco said. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy and useless. Dante refused to pull his eyes from the fragile, broken figure of Alina behind the glass. They already got close once, Dante replied. His voice was a hollow thing, stripped of anger, but carrying the terrifying weight of absolute certainty. That means they had help. Neither man bothered to deny it. The syndicate hunting them had not used brute force. They had found a crack in the armor, slipping poison through the smallest gap. It forces us to confront a truth we all eventually learn the hard way. The blades that cut the deepest and bleed us the most are never held by strangers in the dark. They are carried by the ones standing right beside us. Marco spoke the bitter truth aloud, warning that whoever wanted Alina gone would undoubtedly try again. Dante shifted his weight, the subtle movement of a predator smelling blood on the wind. No, Dante corrected him softly. They will expect her to die here. When you observe a tragedy unfolding, external blind spots, and those blind spots are where monsters thrive. Through the glass, a nurse stepped into the dim room, her hands moving over the intravenous line with practiced ease. But Dante saw the microscopic tremor in her wrist, the way her eyes darted toward the exit, the unnatural stiffness in her shoulders. It is a quiet reminder for all of us. No matter how well we bury our sins, guilt will always leave a visible stain upon the body. That tiny fracture in her composure lasted less than a single heartbeat, but it was all the proof Dante needed. "Who is she?" he demanded, his gaze locked on the woman behind the glass. Marco tracked his stare. "New rotation," Marco murmured. "Cleared through hospital administration." Dante did not blink, yet the air around him felt suddenly lethal. "Bring me her file," he ordered. Marco vanished down the hall, sending silent commands to men who lived and died by Dante's word. Inside the cage of glass, the imposter finished her task. Dante just watched her, completely still. It teaches us a heavy lesson about survival. The most dangerous warnings in our lives are almost never shouted. They are always hidden in the quiet details we choose to ignore. Today, you and I are going to unpack this moment together. Look at how the false nurse moved. Her pale fingers hovered over the plastic medical tubing for a fraction of a second too long. She refused to look at the helpless woman breathing shallowly on the bed. Every ounce of her body weight leaned desperately toward the door, screaming a subconscious desire to run. In Dante's brutal reality, these tiny cracks were a screaming confession. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, until Marco returned. "There is no record," Marco whispered. "She does not exist in the system." Dante finally turned. The grief of a mourning man was entirely gone. We must remember that true danger does not announce itself with loud anger. It arrives quietly, wrapped in absolute, empty calm. "Then she should not be in my hospital," Dante said. The judgment was final, stripped of any mercy. Inside the sterile room, the imposter wrapped her hand around the metal door handle. Time seemed to drag, pulling the impending violence into one single, agonizing breath. Stop her, Dante said softly. He did not yell, because a man with absolute power never has to raise his voice. Marco moved before the sentence was finished. The heavy door flew open as two armed men stepped from the shadows, blocking every escape route with terrifying precision. The nurse froze, her calm facade shattered, exposing the raw animal panic underneath. It proves a universal truth. We can build the most elaborate masks to hide our sins, but reality will always break them in the end. Let us look closer at this scene, piece by piece. The fear in the assassin's eyes was not about getting caught. It was the deeply rooted, desperate terror of failing the people who sent her. Her eyes flicked toward the fragile patient, then down to the poisoned line. "Do not touch anything," Dante said, stepping into the room. Notice how a man like him shifts the gravity of a space just by existing inside it. The slow beeping of the heart monitor suddenly sounded deafening. This was cold, calculated murder. The fake nurse tried to form words, but her voice died in her throat the moment Dante looked directly into her eyes. "Who sent you?" he asked. "There is a lesson here about true strength. It is never found in loud, aggressive threats, but in quiet, crushing certainty." She offered only absolute silence, but the human body always betrays the mind. For a fraction of a second, a flash of recognition sparked in her pale eyes, not for Dante, but for the unseen ghosts who had orchestrated this nightmare. In that exact moment, the tragic truth finally clicked together in Dante's mind. This was not a random strike against the woman he loved. The rot went deep into the foundation. Instead of panic, a freezing, immediate calculation washed over his face. He realized the fortress had crumbled from the inside. Every white coat in the hallway was now a potential threat. It serves as a painful reminder of how fragile trust really is. The walls we build to keep out the monsters are completely useless when the monsters already live inside the house with us. He stepped deeper into the room without a single trace of hesitation. The men surrounding him instantly fell into line, moving with the dark, synchronized grace of a wolf pack backing their alpha. On the hospital bed, Alina lay completely still, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She was entirely unaware of how close she had just come to crossing the line between life and death. The trapped woman opened her mouth to speak again, but the sheer weight of Dante's stare crushed her will to lie. This woman was a human weapon slipped past the gates by people who knew exactly what they were doing. We often forget this simple truth in our daily lives. The most dangerous weapons are never made of cold. They are forged from false empathy and a perfectly rehearsed smile. Marco's expression turned to stone, perfectly mirroring the cold fury radiating from his boss. Without needing to be told, he immediately locked down the digital network, cutting the floor off from the outside world. There were no loud sirens, only a suffocating shift in the air. Stick with me here, because this is where the mind of a broken man reveals itself. Dante's dark eyes traced the clear plastic tube, working backward to see how she had planned to end Alina's life. He realized the deadly drug had not yet reached the bloodstream. He was studying her method like a machine, devoid of any human pity. It reminds us of a dark reality. When pushed past the absolute brink of sorrow, a broken heart stops feeling pain and simply starts calculating survival. The details did not matter anymore. An enemy had studied his life, found his weak point, and timed this attack to the second. They thought Alina would slip away quietly in the dark, but they had underestimated the sheer depth of Dante's devotion. "Clear the line," he ordered. The words were soft, but carried the heavy promise of death. A guard moved to call in a private doctor, they could actually trust. Look at the trapped woman now. Her breathing turned ragged and desperate. Dante watched her, detached from her suffering, as her professional mask dissolved into pure, biological fear. True loyalty is a rare gift. When we find someone worth protecting, we must defend them fiercely against a world that constantly tries to tear love apart. You and I have probably both noticed that the terror shaking her frame was not about the pain Dante would inflict. It was the dread of failing the shadowy figures who pulled her strings. "Who gave you access?" Dante asked again. His voice was completely flat, empty of human warmth. He was slowly closing a mental trap around her, cutting off every escape route. Her silence was not defiance. It was a frantic calculation, weighing the cost of betraying her masters against the guaranteed violence standing right in front of her. Marco stepped back into the light, holding a tablet filled with the hospital network data. A hard truth of life sits right here. Sometimes the absolute heaviest chains we are forced to carry are the invisible debts we carelessly owe to the wrong people. The screen revealed a chilling story. 3 other people on this floor used the same fake badges, slipping into empty rooms within the last 2 hours. Dante read the truth instantly. This was a synchronized purge. The enemy was sweeping the board clean, erasing anyone tied to his empire. This hospital was no longer a place of healing. It had been twisted into a slaughterhouse on his own territory. He asked Marco where the real doctors were, already knowing the terrible answer. They were gone. No security footage, no traces left behind. They had simply vanished into thin air. It is a harsh lesson about the ground we stand on. The places we believe to be the safest can become our graveyards. The very moment we choose, the very moment to close our eyes and stop paying attention. The lens lingers on Dante. Shadows cling to the sharp lines of his face. He studies the captive. Her silence isn't fear. It is a terrifying, calculated void. This enemy knows his darkest corners, the exact rhythm of his breathing, the architecture of his paranoia. It reminds us that our most fatal wounds always come from hands we once trusted. The battered physician steps into the harsh, fluorescent glare, his fingers trembling slightly as he flushes the intravenous line to pull her back from the edge. Dante stands entirely motionless, a statue in the cold room. Yet behind his dead eyes, a frantic machine spins. He catalogues every drop of clear fluid, every twitch of the doctor's wrist, desperately trying to stitch the shattered illusion of his absolute control back together. You and I need to look closely at this moment. Alina's heart monitor chirps, a fragile, stubborn rhythm. Her deep trauma bond forces her broken body to simply refuse death. Then the operative speaks, her voice a dry rasp. She whispers that he is too late. Watch Dante's reaction. He doesn't flinch. A lesser man would lash out, but Dante lets the words hang in the freezing air, absorbing the poison. The tragedy of absolute power is that it isolates you until the truth finally corners you. When he turns to her, his face is carved from ice. He softly tells her not yet, but right behind him, the heavy silence shatters. Marco's shoulders stiffen, a sudden, involuntary flinch. It is the raw, instinctual twitch of a man who just realized the firecracker is already inside the house. Marco's eyes dart toward the doorway, his mind struggling to process the sudden collapse of their fortress. Dante doesn't need a briefing. He feels the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure, the heavy stillness that falls when true authority is violently stripped away. It is a harsh reminder that safety is merely a bedtime story we tell ourselves. Dante feels the floor drop seconds before Marco's radio crackles with frantic static. Out in the hall, the shadows of his men shift, twisting from a calm defense into blind panic. The grand illusion is dead. The captive's dry whisper that they are already out of time lingers in the painfully bright room. It echoes like a cruel verdict handed down from the gods, exposing the deep, bleeding fractures in Dante's heavy iron armor. For the first time, a cold crack forms in Dante's mind. The walls have completely failed. He is no longer stopping a tragedy. He is drowning in its wake. Marco steps closer, his voice tight and breathless with raw fear. He reports movement in the shadows, his eyes frantically scanning the hallway before snapping back. A guard was just found dead in the lower tunnels, cold for at least an hour. Dante's face remains carved in pale marble, but inside the timeline rips him apart. If blood was spilled an hour ago, this ghost walked right past his entire army. We focus so hard on the enemies in front of us, we leave our backs completely bare. It is a brilliant, terrifying performance of deception, playing out perfectly while the arrogant master of control watched the wrong stage. The lens follows Dante's heavy gaze. This is no simple breach. It is a parasite, buried so deep in the hospital's veins that it slipped right past his obsessive watch. He looks down at Alina. The soft blue light of the monitor traces her fragile face. Then, in a heartbreaking shift, he completely shuts off his own heart. The threat below requires the monster inside him to wake up. You and I must remember a harsh truth. Absolute power is just a fragile glass house, waiting for a heavier stone. He orders the floor sealed. His voice is a chilling, flat note of pure authority. No one gets out. No one comes in. Any sudden shadow will be met with gunfire. Marco swallows hard, nodding slowly as the grim reality of a total lockdown settles over the suffocating, silent room. Stick with me because the entire mood is about to break. Notice the armed men, their hands gripped the steel tight, bodies sweating before their minds even understand why. It is pure prey instinct. Dante walks away from Alina's bed, physically cutting the invisible thread between them. In his tragic mind, her ragged breath isn't a miracle. It is just another trophy of his dominance. As they descend into the dark beneath the hospital, the air grows thick and metallic. The clean white walls die away, traded for a damp, rusting maze of iron. A bulb overhead flickers in a slow, jarring rhythm. An ordinary man would walk past it. But Dante watches the shadows dance across the wet concrete, his jaw clenching. He knows exactly what it means. The hunter is deliberately blinding them. Every shadow here is designed to break the mind. The killer placed the fallen guard exactly where Dante's men would trip over him. The steel door is pried open with terrifying grace. The dead man's uniform is completely spotless. It is a haunting picture of silent, brutal efficiency. There is no sign he even saw the end coming. It teaches a painful truth. The most destructive forces in our lives never announce their arrival. Dante crouches beside the pale corpse, his dark coat sweeping the wet concrete. He doesn't mourn the lost boy. He simply studies the twisted neck, reading the violent poetry left behind. He is mapping the soul of an enemy who wants to crush Dante's spirit long before stepping out of the dark. The damp hall splits into the dark, tangled veins of the building, thick oxygen pipes, and the heavy hum of generators. The camera pans slowly. Dante's voice drops to a gravelly whisper. He realizes they didn't come to just shoot Alina. Marco's face drains of color as the trap snaps shut. They are here to force the king into a brutal choice. High above, Alina lies helpless, tied to the life-saving machines. Down here, the entire power grid lies bare. It highlights the tragic irony of building a fortress. The higher your walls, the harder you fall when the foundation is slashed. The enemy isn't aiming for Dante's flesh. They are aiming straight for his rotting soul, turning his obsessive love into the very weapon that will burn his empire to the ground. Somewhere in the shadows stands a phantom director, forcing Dante into a brutal Greek tragedy. It is a sadistic test of a king's ego. A faint metallic click echoes through the freezing corridor. Slipping under the heavy roar of the building, the lens tightens on Dante. He doesn't twitch, but his mind isolates the noise instantly. It isn't a footstep. It is the rhythmic, unforgiving tick of a timer. We always think time is our friend until we hear it bleeding out. His jaw locks, a stone gargoyle holding back a storm, but the air turns instantly toxic. The hunt is over. The execution has started. He barks a single vicious command. His soldiers scatter into the dark, their lights cutting wild, panicked beams through a rusty maze designed explicitly to blind and bury them. Dante stalks toward the ticking sound, his heart beating with a terrifying, dead calm. His dark eyes scan the red fire pipes and massive oxygen tanks. Any piece of this room could be a weapon. The sharp clicking pulls them to a sealed electrical box. Marco rips the steel door off its hinges, and for one agonizing second, the men forget how to breathe. It isn't dynamite. It is a waking nightmare for a man obsessed with control. A small black device is wired directly into the hospital's pulsing iron heart. The glowing screen spits thousands of lines of frantic code, wrapping like a digital snake around the life support grid. This isn't a fire waiting to explode. It is a creeping, silent venom designed to make the entire building slowly choke to death. You and I must pause right here at the edge of his ruin. Dante leans in, the green light reflecting in his hollow eyes. He reads the code and understands the horror. This parasite won't kill everyone at once. It will cut the power bed by bed, starting with Alina. The cruelty is absolute. The unseen ghost is waiting to see if the king will burn his own city to save his fragile queen. The truth doesn't make Dante scream. A suffocating grief simply crushes his chest. It reminds us that true punishment is never physical. It is watching your own arrogant sins destroy the one pure thing you tried to protect. The goal was never just a body count. It was to strip the great man completely bare, leaving his broken, weeping soul exposed to the harsh light. Dante's universe rests on the lie that he can play God without paying the devil's price. The small machine hums against the cold iron, more terrifying than any bomb. The falling numbers reveal a killer who treats this hospital like a gasping victim. This phantom doesn't want quick blood. They want Dante to choke on his own despair, measuring his absolute failure by Alina's fading pulse upstairs. They built this trap so he would have just enough time to feel the heavy weight of his kingdom shattering. Then, Marco's rough voice cuts through the damp silence. The loyal soldier tries to stay firm, but a dark, creeping terror bleeds into his breathless words. The lens pushes in tight, catching the helpless tremor in Marco's jaw. The untouchable king is finally irreversibly falling. Let us step into the room together, you and I, and feel the heavy weight of this exact second. The fluorescent glare of the terminal washes over Dante's face. Marco stands near him, his voice trembling with the terror of a catastrophic system failure and zero backups. Dante offers no words. His unblinking eyes lock onto the crawling code, dissecting the psychology of the man who wrote it. Beneath Dante's armor of clinical detachment, a deeply human panic begins to bleed through. This is no ordinary turf war or blunt physical threat. It is a surgical, intimate violation of his soul. The simple, meaningful truth of life is that our deepest wounds never come from strangers, but from those who know exactly where our armor is the weakest. The camera lingers on the stillness of Dante's shoulders, This attack is a masterpiece of psychological warfare, turning his hidden vulnerabilities into weapons against him. The forged identities, Alina's sudden isolation, and the unborn child Dante never even knew existed. The odds of this being random are 0. Marco whispers that the unseen enemy wants Dante paralyzed, pushing him to make a fatal mistake. Dante's jaw tightens, a tiny shift, proving Marco right. Yet, the expected human panic never arrives. Instead, Dante descends into a chilling, sociopathic calm. They want a reaction, he states with ice in his throat. In life, impulsive reactions make us predictable targets, but a measured, calculated pause is what keeps us truly free. Watch how he moves now, extending his hand toward the humming servers. He does not pull the hardware, but gently traces the pulsing wires, mapping the boundaries of the digital parasite. This trap is designed to force tunnel vision, pushing a desperate man to make a rash choice out of pure fear. But every manipulation carries a flaw. Suddenly, Dante's voice shatters the quiet, barking orders for his men to sever all external access. Marco freezes, completely baffled by the command, but Dante's hyper-focus has locked in. A total shutdown would surrender the entire system. Instead, he chooses to isolate the venom. The lesson here is profound. Sometimes, to protect what we love most from the poison of the outside world, we must cut the cord and stand alone. By forging a closed loop, the predator in the shadows is instantly rendered blind. You can see the realization spark in Marco's eyes as the brilliance of the maneuver washes over him. Commands echo with ruthless efficiency, racing ahead of the virus. Dante's men move like white blood cells, cleanly severing digital arteries and quarantining the infection. The basement holds its breath while the network is rewired. The parasite keeps thrashing, entirely unaware it is screaming into an empty void. High above them, in the critical care unit, Alina's heart monitor flutters for a second, then settles into a steady rhythm. True strength is rarely loud. It is found in the quiet, steady resilience that simply endures after the storm passes. Her fragile biology is finally torn away from the sadistic digital grip that nearly killed her. Dante feels the shift. It is not an emotional release, but a visceral drop in the room's pressure. For the first time since this nightmare started, the stress hormones in his veins begin to ebb. Yet, it is not true relief. It is only the brief delay of grief. Marco whispers that the threat can finally be deleted. Dante gives a single, heavy nod. The strokes fall, and the menacing algorithm collapses into harmless, dead data. The silence that fills the space is entirely different now. It is no longer the suffocating quiet of an ambush, but the cold, clinical stillness of a morgue. It reminds us that surviving a deep tragedy never means walking away completely unscarred. Let's pause here, you and I, because this frame holds a devastating life lesson. Those who obsessively seek to control everything are always the easiest to manipulate. Dante does not relax. His paranoid mind is still turning, his dark eyes dissecting the ruined code to find the architect's real motive. With a slow, mechanical dread, he pulls his encrypted phone from his coat. He does not speak a word into it. There is no need, because the psychological bomb has already been planted. Glowing on the screen is a single sentence without a sender. The words hit like a physical blow, a masterstroke of cruelty from one apex predator to another. She was never the true target. The illusion of absolute control is simply the most dangerous lie we ever tell ourselves. Watch closely as the ironclad psyche of a criminal kingpin shatters on screen. The genius of his enemy's manipulation becomes agonizingly clear. The hospital, Alina's failing heart, the revelation of the pregnancy. They were nothing but a grand, theatrical diversion designed by a masterful psychopath. Dante's face remains a perfectly blank canvas, but underneath, every wire in his mind is snapping. He realizes he committed the ultimate sin. He left his deepest vulnerability unprotected. The attack was never meant to erase his empire or his past. It is a brutal, unforgiving truth we must all face in life. We spend so much of our precious energy building walls around what we already possess that we leave our vital futures entirely unguarded and waiting for the wolves. This elaborate chess game was built for one singular purpose: to violently amputate Dante from his own future. I have spent years observing the dark hearts of men, and this is the classic predator's strike. They do not just draw blood, they burn your potential to ash. Dante suddenly spins with kinetic fury, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp command to get him back upstairs. But his eyes betray the terrifying truth. His mind is no longer in the medical ward. He knows that far beyond these fortified walls, his true heart sits exposed. It is a sobering reminder that no matter how obsessively we try to lock the world away, we can never shield everything we love from the chaos. And for Dante, this heartbreaking realization has almost certainly arrived far too late.